Explaining autism to a child can feel like a bit of a tricky thing to do. Lots of parents find that they only have to explain what autism is when they realise that their child might actually have autism. And this conversation comes about after maybe a teacher's flagged it up, maybe the child is on the pathway, maybe the child has been on the pathway for a while, maybe the child's even had the assessment and the diagnosis and the parents still haven't really brought it up with the child. How can this be? You may wonder, how can a child have an assessment and not even know? Well, we're going to talk about all of that today. We're going to talk about talking to children about autism, how to bring it up, when you should bring it up, if you have to bring it up, if it is brought up in the assessments, and honestly, should we be talking to all of our children about autism, whether they have autism or not? And spoiler alert, the answer to that last question is yes, because whether your child has autism or not, whether anyone in your family has autism or not, there will be children in their class that have autism, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed. There will be people they come across in life that have autism, diagnosed or undiagnosed. And by understanding what it is, as with anything that makes anyone differently abled or just individual or unique, it's just a nice thing, I think, in the world if we have understanding of other people's perspectives or ourselves or our families or all of it. It helps us to be a bit more compassionate, a bit more understanding to those people who may have autism or indeed to ourselves. Anyway, if you're new around here, hello, my name is Rhiannon Morgan. Everyone calls me Rhi. Welcome to the Real Talk with Rhi podcast, where we hang out and we have chats all about mum life, about autism, because 4 of my children have autism, and about ADHD, because I was diagnosed with that at age 40 and I'm now 41 and still kind of figuring all that stuff out. So if you enjoy all that, then please hang out a little bit more. I'd love to have you as part of the gang. So ultimately, when should you tell your child about autism and how should you do this? First of all, I'm going to bring up something about how we talk about it. Now, personally, I refer to my children as having autism as opposed to being autistic. Now, this is because a long time ago, I guess when the first of my children was being assessed, I read something that kind of resonated, that having autism and being autistic, it's not the whole, it's not who the person, it is and it isn't. It's not the entirety of the person. It's just something that is part of their makeup. So it's like having brown eyes is part of, like, I have brown eyes, but that's not all of me. And I think, I'm not explaining it terribly well, I don't think, sorry, but this kind of like autism is a part of them. They have it, but it's not their entirety. So it was Will that was diagnosed first. It's like Will has autism, but William isn't autism. So this is why I leant towards the has autism as opposed to is autistic phrasing. And the things I was reading at the time were suggesting that that was the way to talk about it. It feels like there may be a bit of a movement now towards people preferring the term is autistic or has autism. I don't know. I think what I'm asking you guys as a community really is to let me know your answers to this, because as much as I'm surrounded by autism and I guess I know more about it than your average person, I'm still learning. I think we all are. So if you are a person watching this video who has been diagnosed with autism or is in the process of it, which term do you personally prefer? Do you prefer has autism or is autistic or something else altogether? Because I'd just really be curious to know your preferences, and maybe that will shape how I kind of talk to my children about it in the future. I will definitely talk to my children about it as they get older. But for now, in our house, we talk and say so-and-so has autism. So that's the term I'm going to use in this video, but I'm definitely open to being educated if you people watching this video as a community have a preference one way or another. So that's the language I choose to use. You do you when you're talking to your child about this. So when should you tell your child? This is a tricky question. It's going to be dependent on the child's age, and how you tell your child is also going to be dependent upon the child's age. And I think largely when you tell your child that they are going to be assessed, obviously depends on the child's age, because the younger they are, the more oblivious to the whole process they're going to be, and I'll explain why in a second. But an element of it is going to be where you are as a parent on the acceptance journey. Whether this should be a factor or not, I'm going to guess that it is. So if you have just been told that your children might have autism, or your child's very unlikely to be lots of children at one time identified, but your child may have autism, it is quite possible, as a parent, you may not be ready to discuss that yet with your child, with whoever. Maybe you don't agree that this is the case. Maybe you're just not there yet. And I think the not being quite there yet, and I'm going to kind of digress a little bit from the topic, but I will come back to it, I promise. The not being quite there yet can be a little bit of a problem for parents when teachers come to them and say, I think we may be dealing with autism here. And the parents will be saying, no, don't think so, we're fine, we're doing fine. The parents then delay putting the child's name down on a waiting list. And then in a couple of years' time, when things have progressed and got worse, they then go back to the school and say, look, yeah, I know you said we think we're dealing with autism here. I think you're right, I need help. But then they're years behind in the waiting list thing. So my advice is always at that point, and I'm going to reiterate this here, even though it's not what the video is about, because I think it's important to say. If a teacher comes to you and says, I think we may be dealing with autism here, but, what do you want to do? Do you want to put them forward for assessment? My advice to you would be, even if you think, I think we're fine, I think they're coping, I think you're wrong, if you think all those things, what I would say to you is an assessment is not going to cause any harm or damage. It's not invasive. And perhaps the sad truth is, it's not going to be soon, okay? It's not going to be anytime soon. It's going to be a long flipping while until that assessment happens. So if you're in two minds and you're not in the acceptance stage yet, putting the child's name down a list just means they're going to sit there on that list for a long time. Hopefully this situation will change soon, but from what I'm hearing from around the country, and certainly, what we've dealt with through the school system, the waiting lists are long. So your child's name will sit there on that list for a long time. And then when it comes to the child's turn to be assessed, you don't have to make the decision till then, okay? So when your child then comes to the top of the list and it's time for them to be assessed, my guess is that will be a couple of years down the line. You will then have the clarity to either be like, honestly, they're absolutely fine. Any concerns I had before have gone. Any behaviours that were being flagged up before that were concerning, that particular teacher, which was probably a few classes back, was noticing, they don't do anymore. And at that stage, you can just be like, it's fine, give their place to someone else on the list. Or the behaviours will have become more prominent and you'll be like, thank goodness I put their name down. So my point is, you don't have to make a decision at the time that the child's going on the waiting list. The decision, and it's still not a massive decision, because if you go ahead with the assessment, no one's going to be diagnosing anyone with autism doesn't have autism. Trust me, the assessment's really in depth. But you don't have to make the decision on whether even they're going to have to be assessed until then. Sorry, itchy nose. So my point is, if you don't have to decide until the child is due to be assessed, if you're not in the place of kind of, yes, I think we're dealing with autism here, you probably don't have to tell your child at that stage that they may have autism if you don't actually believe it's the case either. And if you genuinely believe they are coping in school pretty well, there may be some signs and it's kind of being looked into as a maybe. if you don't want to speak to your child about it at that stage, then I don't see any reason that you have to. However, is there any harm in it? No. Not if you explain it the way that we're going to talk about today. So the way that I have explained autism to my children currently, and we'll go into like a bit more of an age by age thing in a minute, but the way I talk to my children about autism who are nearly eight. They're all, I'm going to give them the new ages because by the time, if you're watching this video, their birthdays are all imminent or just gone. So Zara is nearly 8, William is nearly 13, Bella is probably, by the time you're watching this, actually just turned 10, and our eldest Dylan is 20. And the way I talk about it with them is everybody struggles with something. Nobody is absolutely amazing at everything. So, I'd be like, Mummy's good at things on the computer, Daddy's good at more practical and building stuff, and things that I'm good at, he's not, and vice versa. And some things that you're good at or not good at don't have a label. And some things that you're good at or not good at do have a name and a label. And being just very, very shy doesn't really have a diagnosis or any formal help or recognition. It's just something you kind of have to get over. Being not brilliant at maths, if you're not at the level where you're diagnosed with, is it dyscalculus? Then there's no actual formal help for that. It's just bad at maths. And then hopefully your parents get you a tutor. Hopefully you've got a good maths teacher that helps you through it. But that's it. You're just not that good at it. I am absolutely terrible with spatial awareness. I don't think there's a name for that. I don't think, I know I have ADHD, but I don't think it's an ADHD thing. Parallel parking totally spins me out. I can't figure out which way to turn the wheel. I've been driving for many, many years. I passed my driving test when I was 19, and I still can't parallel park. There's no name for that. And my drawing skills are, I'm right-handed, but I could be drawing with my right hand and you'd swear I'd drawn whatever it was with my left foot. I'm not bad at it, but there's no name for that. It's just something that I'm really not that good at. So autism just describes your particular, I'm saying this to my children, your particular set of struggles. So some people struggle with maths and English, or literacy, they call it in school now, don't they? Some people struggle with maths and literacy. You don't. It's not to say that all people with autism don't struggle with those things, but when I'm talking to my children, this is what I say. Those things you find easy, and you sort of look at other people struggling with them, and you sort of, because you find it so easy, it's like, but it's so, it seems so simple. And when you find something easy, it's sometimes hard to understand that other people might struggle with it. And autism is a set of struggles that generally people with autism have. Now, everyone with autism will have slightly different degrees of these struggles, but generally people with autism will struggle with cueing, will struggle with change of routine, will struggle with sensory stuff, so bright flashing lights, loud noises. And then I say, it's funny because, if I'm talking to my little ones, I say little, William's taller than me now, but you know what I mean. Will is really not that bothered by the sensory stuff. Flashing lights, loud noises. If you saw over on my main channel, Mummy of 4 UK, we did Alton Towers. We did like a mini vlog series in Scarefest. We did all these scare mazes, which honestly, I'm not joking, they were terrifying, like absolutely terrifying. Okay, just totally terrifying. Really sensory, the smells, the things dangling in your face. It was dark, and there's people jumping out of you and then grabbing you, and he loved it. He loved it more than me. I survived it for him because he needed an adult to go in with him. He flipping loved it, which is not what you'd expect from someone with autism. However, changed his routine, not liking it. That morning when he thought we were going to be late because we were supposed to be meeting at a certain time to go into this event, he was really stressed. And we had this conversation going into one of the scare mazes. We'd just been in a couple of scare mazes. We're queuing to go into another one. Even the queue was scary. It wasn't a long queue. It was like a booking thing, but the queue itself was, like creepy. And I said, it's funny, isn't it? I said to him, it just doesn't bother you, the sensory stuff, like it bothers the girls, and the girls are not as bothered as some people with the sensory stuff, Bella is less bothered than Zara. Zara now does Warrior Defenders quite a lot. And I said, it's funny because it just doesn't bother you. I said, however, if we're running late for something, and he replies, the world is ending. So he has that awareness that he has those struggles. So that's how I explain it to my children. It's just a way of explaining a specific set of struggles that someone might experience. But even though someone with autism experiences those struggles, they experience them to different degrees. So Zara's more bothered by loud noises, which is funny because actually most of the noise in the house comes from Zara. That's where most of the noise comes from. But it's just interesting that they all fit within this autism umbrella, but it is such a spectrum that people have different degrees of struggling with each of the elements. So that's a very long-winded way of how I discuss it with my children. I think you've got to remember there's no perfect script to follow. You've got to kind of do what you're comfortable with, but you really do need to keep their age in mind. So how you're explaining it to a 5-year-old would be totally different to how you explain it to a 12-year-old. So for younger children, if you're going 3 to 6 and you actually want to explain it, so you could say something like, everyone's different, everyone's brains work differently. You are really good at noticing small details, which is another kind of strength, perhaps. I think it is. It can be a real strength with autism, the noticing the finer details. One of the challenges that comes up is perhaps missing the bigger picture. But my children are all, and my husband actually, just the attention to detail is insane. Like we had over Christmas, our elf that came to stay with us, and she was hiding some pretty tricky spots, and the children just found her straight away all the time. It's that attention to detail. So you could say to very young children, you're really good at noticing small details, but you find cueing or bright flashy lights a bit tricky, and we call that autism. And they'll be like, okay, and they'll go back to playing. For slightly older children, you could talk a bit more about the strengths versus the struggles. So things that they're really good at. And I do think it's really important when discussing it to say that everyone has strengths and everyone has struggles, and these are your particular set of strengths and struggles. I think it is a little bit of a misconception that everyone with autism is super good at certain things, because obviously it is a spectrum and not every person with autism is amazing at maths, for example. But if you know your child has some real strengths, especially if they are things that are perhaps related to autism, although it doesn't really matter. If you know your child has strengths, when discussing autism or anything with them, you can be like, look, you're really good at this and this and this and this. You struggle with bright lights, cueing, sensory stuff. You can talk about random, very specific things they struggle with. So our eldest is really sort of spun out by the texture of certain hangers that are a bit velvety. Can't cope with those at all. And you could say, you know how you like everything to be lined up in a certain way, and your friend, whoever, Billy down the road, isn't bothered if things are all a mess, isn't bothered if things are out of order, isn't bothered by change of routine. Well, that's just the difference between autism, and then the other word you can use is neurotypical. So if you want to flip it over totally, you can be like, you know how you're good at X, Y, and Z, but you struggle with loud noises and things being out of order and out of routine. Well, that's called autism. And you know how your friend doesn't care if everything's all backwards, but struggles a bit with things that you find easy. That's called neurotypical. And it's almost like, not that everyone else is this and you are something else. It's just some people are neurotypical and some people have autism. Some people are neurospicy is another good way of saying it. I think neurospicy is such a nice umbrella term for all the things, the autism, the ADHD. And we very much have a neurospicy household. That's a term I use a lot. It just covers it all so nicely. But by splitting it into some people are neurotypical, some people are neurodivergent, or some people are neurotypical, some people have autism, some people are neurotypical, some people have ASD or are autistic, whichever term that you prefer, whichever term you're comfortable with. And that can be a really nice way of differentiating and just explaining it. And honestly, it doesn't have to be this big, big thing. It should be, I feel, delivered in a way and discussed in a way that at the end of the conversation, they're like, oh, okay, can I go back to playing now? And that's how my children have been, the way I've discussed it with them. It can be a huge help if you already know people in your real life, or if not, you have to just go to famous people who also have autism. So it was a really easy way to explain it to Zara when she was diagnosed, because obviously the others already had autism, and it was a case of, you know how they have autism? Well, we're just going to find out if you do too. And then she's like, oh, okay, fair enough. So if you have someone in your life, chances are there will be other people with children who have been diagnosed. There will probably be adults in your life that you're like, wow, the more I learn about autism, Uncle Bob clearly has autism. Like, it seems blatantly obvious now, but Uncle Bob is in his 60s and will probably never be assessed. So you can use examples of people that you know. Bit tricky if you're using examples of people that clearly have autism but they don't know it themselves. So that might be a tricky one and maybe worth avoiding if your children are going to be talking to that person, even though it might be a helpful way to explain it to your child. You might end up in a little bit of a tricky situation where your child's like, oh, I've got autism like you. And they're like, sorry, what? So maybe avoid that one. But if there are people that have autism that you know of, that are discussing it, then definitely just be like loads of people we know have it. Looking up famous people. I did look up some famous people, actually, some famous people with autism. I don't really do this that much with my children, so I had to look it up. So we've got famous people with autism. I found Greta Thunberg, climate change activist. Chris Packham is apparently a British naturalist, TV presenter and wildlife expert. Temple Grandin, world-renowned animal behaviourist, apparently. And she's an autism activist, isn't she? Anthony Hopkins apparently has autism. And Daryl Hannah. So I don't think any of those people are really going to be like, wow, really? To my children? Which is probably why I've not bothered, discussing that with them. Famous people with ADHD, however, so you can say that these people are neurodivergent, or obviously if you're explaining ADHD to your child, replace everything I'm saying with ADHD and you can talk about these people. Simone Biles, who's that gymnast who's amazing, Olympic gold medalist. Michael Phelps, who's an Olympic swimmer. will.i.am, the musician. Emma Watson, who she's Hermione, isn't she, from Harry Potter, has ADHD, and Justin Timberlake. So at least they're a bit more, perhaps, people the children may have heard of. And, it's just nice to be like, hey, this is not just you. This is something that a lot of people have. It's definitely something I do say to my children, that we know you have autism because I fought quite hard to make sure we could get assessments, and that way I could know how to best support you, and then I would be able to get any support you need as you go through life and in the future. So if you needed somewhere quieter to do exams, or if you needed, I don't know, to take time out of a lesson to have, certainly as you go to secondary school, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, if you needed like 5 minutes out of lesson to go and breathe, come back into the lesson, then I would be able to get you that support. So what I actually say to them is, I know a lot of people have autism and will never actually get formally diagnosed. What we actually say is, daddy's probably got autism, but he was never picked up as a child because it just wasn't a thing that was noticed when he was younger. And it wasn't noticed in anyone, not just in daddy, but it wasn't noticed in anyone. So daddy's probably got autism. So even though he isn't diagnosed, he has the same struggles as you. So we do explain it like that. And the other thing I say is, a lot of people probably will never be diagnosed because they don't have someone like me pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. I do explain to them that I know that when they're in primary school, then the teachers know them really, really, really well. And they kind of are able to like know all the children quite well because they've got one class, haven't they, all week for a year, and they get to know everyone quite well. But when they go to secondary school, they're going to have, 10, 12 teachers, and 10, 12 teachers can't possibly know every child in every class that well. So I wanted them to have that understanding. I do explain to them, I talk quite openly about this. Will's nearly 13 now, but I say that, Will was quite busy and quite challenging, and I just didn't really want him to be misunderstood and misbranded and mislabeled as naughty, because he wasn't naughty. He just didn't really like conforming to the stuff that other kids his age wanted to do. He was incredibly bright, and my worry was that he'd be misunderstood. So I've used all of those different things to explain it to them. Now, when the children were actually being assessed, the 3 little ones, I didn't discuss it with them. They were all really young. And honestly, they just went and played games in a very relaxed setting. They did have to play games. I've done a whole episode where I talk about the actual ADOS assessments and breaking it all down. So please go and check those out afterwards if you want to know the full details. But it was very much playing games with very nice people, playing with toys. And the assessments were, not only were they not invasive, they were just unbothered by them. They were fine. They were playing with things. They didn't necessarily react in a way that I would expect them to react to things, because they had autism. So I was watching them going, oh, I can see what they're trying to get them to do here, and they're not doing that. Fair enough. But they were unbothered, totally unbothered. And the children do remember. It's funny. Zara was she 5, I think? I have to look back, when she was assessed, and she can remember the dress she was wearing when she went to the place. So when Zara was being assessed, I was like, do you remember when Bella went to that place and played, and we used the name of the building, but do you remember when Bella went to so-and-so place and played with those toys, and then they found out did she have autism or not, and she did? Well, we're going to do that with you. We're just going to find out if you've got autism or not, and if you've got autism like this lot, or if you haven't like some other people. No big deal. So I didn't explain it initially to, I think the first 2, I think I'd mentioned it to Zara, and then it was like, oh, by the way, when we did those things where we played with the toys, turns out you do have autism. You're in the same little gang as this lot, isn't that fun? And it's like, yeah, okay, cool, fine. Slightly different with our eldest. When he was being assessed, I felt it was COVID, it was a weird time. He was older, he was teenagers can be really challenging anyway. But ultimately, there was no option, not that I was hiding it from the others, but it was just sort of not worth discussing with them. Will specifically would have been unbothered and disinterested in discussing it. But at the age he was anyway. But how do I best put this? There was no hiding. There was no option then to hide it, even if I wanted to, which I didn't. But when our eldest was being assessed, he was very much more involved in all of the questions. And some of the questions were quite like, do I really have to have this discussion with you in front of my child? Because they were, I don't know, I felt like it was sort of listing out the things that were quote unquote wrong with him and in front of him. And I don't know, that's a chat for another day. But I felt that the assessment when he was older was certainly tougher. It was a tougher experience for me and for him than I think the younger ones' assessments were, which were very, very chilled, very laid back, and they were not involved in all of the questions about the behaviour, about the concerns, whereas he was more involved in those questions, and he was at a place where he was not interested in hearing all of that. So it was a challenging time. He has said actually he'd come onto the podcast and have a chat with me, because now he's got a totally different attitude. Now he's like, wow, sorry it was so difficult. I've read over my autism diagnosis report again recently, and it's all that and more. There was stuff that was missed because I wasn't being like fully open. I wasn't participating fully in the process. And he's now very much like, well, I'm just so glad I understand how my brain works. And I'm so glad that you did what you did. At the time, that was not his opinion. And at the time, it was challenging. At the time, he just didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to be different in any way, even though all three of his siblings, I think by then, had been assessed and diagnosed. So if we could have understood this and had him assessed and diagnosed younger, I think it would have been easier on him. But ultimately, it's come to the same place right at the end, which now he is 20 and is glad that he has that understanding of his own brain. But ultimately, the older the child is, the option to just see how it goes and discuss autism with them later kind of goes away. Obviously, our eldest already knew what autism was because his siblings had autism. It was just the fact that autism, and recognize it in himself, it was definitely a conversation that had to be had because those assessments came up and there was no hiding it. Not that it's something to be hidden, but I hope you understand what I'm kind of getting at here, that they're just that much more involved, I guess, when they get to the assessment stage at that age, that it's really important to have had a really thorough discussion with them about autism before you get to that stage. Whereas you've got the option when your children are littler to discuss whether they have autism or not after they're diagnosed, and they really wouldn't know the difference. But I think the main takeaway that I would have is that we should all talk about what autism is to our children and all educate ourselves a little bit on it. Whether we have it, our children have it, we don't have it, we're neurotypical, we're neurodiverse. Where's the harm in having that conversation and making our children understanding of other people's struggles, even if it's something they don't find challenging? Because like I said before, it's so hard to imagine sometimes when you find something super easy. It's like, what? People struggle with that? What? So your child, that if they're neurotypical and they go to a school disco, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. Why would anyone struggle with this? Explaining autism to them may have more empathy for someone that does struggle with it. And hopefully, if we can all have a little bit more empathy, we can all just make a slightly more understanding and kind world where we can support each other a little bit more, just be a bit nicer to each other, really. So have you talked to your children about autism? Do you have autism in your family? Is it a conversation you've had to have for that reason? And if not, have you discussed it with your children, even if they're neurotypical? Do you intend to? And fingers crossed you will. Please do share this with anyone you think could benefit from hearing it. And hopefully, we'll just work a tiny bit at a time to make the world a little bit more of an understanding place. So I did talk about the video podcast that I recorded for you guys about the autism assessment, and I really broke that down. And I'm talking about my younger children in that video, but I think it's really, really valuable. It's the same kind of assessment with slight tweaks, and we'll talk about that in the future. Let me know if you want to hear that video, that recording, that podcast of me chatting to my eldest about his experience with the process. And if that would be helpful, I will set that up with him and we will get that out to you. But for now, click on the video on screen and you can watch that video where I talked all about the autism assessment process with my younger school-age children, and hopefully that'll be super helpful. Or hang out with me a bit more in my Patreon. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you real soon. Bye.